This is U.S. History 2, Chapter 6, Section 2, the Spanish-American War. So, Cuba is this tiny, it's not really a tiny island, but it's this island, probably the largest island in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico. It's 90 miles south of Florida. It's really close. Some people even have swam it before. Since 1492, Cuba has been under Spanish rule. This is one of the first areas that Christopher Columbus discovered when he was sailing to the New World. And since that time, up until 1890, in the 1890s, it was under Spanish control. So eventually, in 1895, the Cubans rebelled against the Spanish. They had enough. The Spanish retaliated pretty harshly. They put the native Cuban people into concentration camps. It was called reconcentration, but it was a forced movement of large numbers of people into these detention camps, so they couldn't organize to rebel against the Spanish. Very similar to the famous Holocaust with concentration camps. People were starving, weren't treated well. They were prisoners. 200,000 Cubans died during this reconcentration camps in this time because of the lack of food and sanitation. So these Cuban exiles who were able to escape the Spanish before they went into concentration camps, they were kicked out of Cuba before they were going to be in the camps, but they made it to the United States. And they told this story what was happening in Cuba, and the Americans became very sympathetic towards the Cubans and wanted the U.S. government to intervene. They're right there, they're our neighbors, we should help these people, they're dying. And some Americans just wanted to protect their investments that they had in Cuba's sugar and rice plantations. This is a sugar plantation in Cuba. Cutting down sugar cane, a lot of money to be made there, and Americans wanted to protect their investment in that farming. So yellow journalism, this really started, it seems like news has always been a bit of exaggeration, but this particular, time period where this exaggeration in news was called yellow journalism. Um, News wasn't really based on facts so much as the gross generalization and exaggerations to sell newspapers. That's what it's all about. The more newspapers you sell, the more money you make, and the more you need interesting stories for people to buy them. It's true today. The use of this is really where the use of these bold, shocking headlines began topping newspapers. It's an eye catcher. So you're like, oh, you see that big headline, you're supposed to buy it. So Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World newspaper, he was really the one that started it all. If you know Pulitzer, he's from the musical Newsies. This is that time period. If you've ever seen it, these newspaper giants, they're trying to sell more and more newspapers. So, anyways, this yellow journalism, like I said, wouldn't exactly tell the truth in the reporting. It'd be based on some kind of truth, and they would just be kind of guessing. They would exaggerate what actually happened. Like I said, facts weren't always the basis. William Randolph Hearst, he was the owner of the New York Journal. He was kind of Joseph Pulitzer's rival, and they rivaled each other, and they were competing for newspaper sales. This caused even more gross exaggerations in the headlines and articles. They needed very interesting stories to catch the reader and make them buy their newspaper. And also, they had to be the first to report such things. And this is what's going on today. And the media works so fast that everybody wants to be the first one out there. And when you put out articles so fast and news media so fast, it's hard to check all your bases and all your sources. So that's why, Donald Trump like to say the fake news. there's a lot of inaccurate news out there, and it's really hard to tell which one is the real uh, story. So, like I said, it's all about who can release the news the fastest without taking much account of the factual information, what sells, or you can skew factual information. So, these are just some of the bold headlines. It really, woman jumps from Brooklyn Bridge, survives. Like, what's this about? It makes you want to know. How does that happen? Um, you know, peace trees are having awful slaughter. It's like, oh, something terrible. It makes you want to read into the newspaper. So, going back to Cuba, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were being made aware of the Cuban situation, but they didn't really have all the facts. But they would release information, that there was terrible things going on, and they would release that information as best they could to get newspaper sales. It was hard to get the facts, but they just kind of made some of them up, and they wanted to spin this attractive narrative to lead to this outrage against the Spanish. Believe it or not, war sells newspapers, and so if we can, you know, spin this narrative that the Spanish are evil, they're thinking that they'll sell more newspapers. Like Spanish feeding prisoners to sharks. Like, whoa, like that's a newspaper grab. Like, you know, blood on the roadsides, blood in the fields, blood on the doorsteps. Like, whoa, what's going on in Cuba? It's like people are interested and they want to read newspapers, and the more newspapers they will sell. So, eventually, in 1898, fighting between the native and Cubans and the Spanish broke out in Havana, Cuba, the capital. So now there's active fighting in Cuba. William McKinley, the president at the time, sent a battleship, the USS Maine, to protect American lives and property in Havana Harbor. There was Americans in the city of Havana. They wanted to make sure Americans got out of there and were safe, so they sent this battleship. Shortly after the Maine reached the harbor, though, on February 15th, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. 260 men died. The ship literally exploded in the middle of the night. No one knew exactly how the Maine exploded. But these newspaper owners were going to take a good guess. All right, this catastrophe was definitely going to sell them newspapers, and so they were going to spin this narrative. And what's the narrative to spin that would sell the most newspapers? Blame the Spanish. That's a better story than reporting that who knows what happened to the USS Maine. So it's like, oh, if we blame the Spanish, now we got a story. And so the Americans began pressuring the government to go to war with Spain because of this alleged attack. Even though now we know that it was most likely not the Spanish that blew them up in the middle of the night. It was probably a magazine, where you keep all the torpedoes and everything. I think one of them sparked up and blew the ship in half. That's most likely what happened, because the Spanish did not take responsibility for it. All right, so these are some of the headlines that really would drew people in. Fear that Spain may declare war. There crisis at hand. The Spanish treachery. Main explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. Like, they don't know. No one knew. We still don't know for sure. And destruction of the warship Maine. Work of an enemy. So President McKinley did not want to go with war with Spain, but there was a lot of pressure from the American public. There was American sailors dead. So he had to declare war on Spain shortly after the explosion. Remember the Maine was the popular cry for Americans to rally together for the war effort, to revenge the lost sailors. So the Spanish-American War started, and there's actually two fronts of the war. Cuba here and the Philippines, both controlled by the Spanish. And to go with war with Spain, the Americans thought they'd attack both fronts. So like I said, it started not in Cuba, but in the Philippines. The United States attacked first. Commodore George Dewey attacked the naval fleet in Manila Bay, Philippines. It was over pretty fast. This small fleet that the Americans sent over sank the entire squadron of Spanish ships. They just destroyed them, and they didn't lose one sailor in the whole entire fight. And this is kind of like the water fight here, just blowing up the Spanish ships. So easy win out in the Philippines, and then going back to Cuba. After the Philippines were in control, all the focus was on defeating the Spanish in Cuba. American ground forces started in June 1898. Surprisingly, the American troops that were sent were poorly trained, and poorly equipped for such an environment in Cuba. It's tropical, it's hot. They weren't ready. They didn't have enough supplies and munitions, but they were eager to fight. And Theodore Roosevelt, who is not president yet, he's actually the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He takes it upon himself to rally a volunteer cavalry force called the Rough Riders to Cuba. So the Rough Riders are famous for one particular battle, and it was the Battle of San Juan Hill. Theodore Roosevelt personally, they said, led the charge up San Juan Hill. All these Spanish were shooting down on them, and the Rough Riders and Theodore Roosevelt overtook the hill and won victory for the United States. And that kind of is the gave Rough Riders their legendary status. So there's actually a movie called Rough Riders that depicts their whole experience in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and there's quite a long scene about the charge up San Juan Hill. It's made in the 90s. Here's the YouTube link if you want to see it. So the U.S. defeats the Spanish, mostly because of the strength of the American Navy. The American Navy became really strong at this point in history, around the turn of the century, and controlling the seas was important. And they defeated the Spanish. They signed a peace treaty in December 1898. So the whole war was over in less than a year. And the terms of the treaty was that Spain recognized Cuba's independence. The Spanish left Cuba. Cubans are allowed to rule themselves. The Spanish also gave the U.S. control of Puerto Rico, which is in the Caribbean, Philippines, like we talked about before, and some islands in the Pacific Ocean, Guam and Wake. So the U.S. still has Puerto Rico in control and Guam in control. They are U.S. territories. And then in return, the U.S. paid only $20 million in return. So that was kind of the treaty. So the United States, after the Spanish-American War, they're gaining traction. Like, hey, we're taking over areas, we're getting new areas, new territories. They pretty much control the Caribbean. But the Cubans and the people in the Caribbean didn't really like they traded the Spanish for the United States, and now they're under United States control. And then the United States, after defeating the Spanish, who were controlling the Philippines, now the United States has an interest in the Philippines. But there was a revolt in the Philippines against any kind of United States control. 4,000 Americans died, 20,000 Filipinos died in this revolt, so it was this whole mess. Eventually the Filipinos, the revolt ended relatively quickly and would remain for another 40 years underneath the United States control until the end of World War II in 1946. All right, this completes Chapter 6, Section 2.